All right, all right. Welcome to session number 3 of our adoptive stress, trauma, and behavior, our 10-week virtual trauma responsive wraparound training for our providers and our parents with your host with the most, Bryan Post, yours truly. Hope everyone's doing fantastic. We've got a lot of information to cover. And I'm just like, I've got this energy flowing through my body and through my brain. And I've been thinking about you guys, thinking. I love to think. It's something I like to do. And, I was thinking so I watched session 2 yesterday evening, and I watched it again this morning. And I'm just wondering, how many times have you guys watched these sessions? Because if you haven't watched it, 2 or 3 times, well, I'm ahead of you, and I don't need to be ahead of you. I don't want to be ahead of you. I want to be beside you. But if you're going to run with me, you gotta become a student. You got to be a student. And we're going to start off this conversation. We're going to change our whole culture. This is what we're going to do. We're going to change our whole culture. I was listening to, I love educational stuff. So I'm always listening to educational stuff. So I was listening to this educational program the other day, and this guy's name's 19 Keys. He said, new levels of consciousness require a new language. New levels of consciousness require a new language. And I was like, yes. New levels of consciousness. That's what we are doing. We're not learning a new parenting sequence of techniques. We're not learning new parenting tools. And I've said for a long time, I don't want to teach you tools. I want to teach you understanding. We're not learning a new understanding about parenting, and we're not learning how to be in a different way with the families that we serve. We are developing a new consciousness. And that new consciousness has its own language. And this is why for the last 10 to 15 years, probably 10 years, I've just become more obsessed. In fact, it has been about 10 years, because I started and I became very conscious of it when I was in Virginia. So that was about 10 years ago. I became more conscious of language. The language. In fact, just the other day in session 2 or session 1, I think it was, I was having the conversation with you all about the parents that I was in the backyard with, having the session, and the mom used some wording, and I said, well, let's stop right there and let's look at that for a moment. And she said, well, I didn't mean that word. But that word came out because that was the word that was reflective of the feeling. And the statement was, I know I can't control everything he does. That word control is an old paradigm word. The real, it is a word that represents a different consciousness. The true definition of the word control is to influence behavior, but we use the word control to physically control another's behavior, or to mentally, emotionally control their behavior. But the real true definition of the word control means to influence behavior. Huge difference, because it's a whole nother level of consciousness. We want to use words that are reflective of a new consciousness. And I'm not going to go light on you guys. I'm not going to go light because I can't. I have to go heavy, because that's what's in my brain, and that's what's on my heart. I have to go heavy with this information. We have to use new words that represent our new consciousness, because we want to be reflective of a new consciousness. We want to leave the old school behind. Because we have too much information, we have too much education, we have too much knowledge now, we have too much wisdom now to continue to try to operate in old consciousness, i.e. old paradigm ways, and to try to create something new. You can't create something new by operating in old paradigm ways. In order to create something new, you have to become new. You can't change your family from the perspective and the standpoint of the person that you've always been. See, you want that's and this is what old consciousness does. Old consciousness has informed you that you can change your child without changing yourself. That's old consciousness. New consciousness says you change your child by changing yourself. That's what new consciousness says. So we put more focus and more emphasis on ourselves and our own process. So we want to use words that are reflective of a new conscience. And today, I reworked our goal for the training. So our goal for the training is to raise the collective consciousness of human behavior. So we want to elevate our collective consciousness. And when I say our collective, I'm just talking about us as a group. This is our community. Those of us that are participating in it, this is our group, this is our family, this is our culture. We're going to raise the collective consciousness of our group, because you're going to talk to other people about this information, and it's going to be foreign to them, and it's going to even be threatening to them, and it's going to be like you're speaking a different language. But we don't care about that, because we know that we are developing something new. So to raise the collective consciousness of human behavior and to provide a new language in which to define and explain it. So we're going to use a new language to define and explain it. And it's so simple. It reminds me when I started saying, timeout sucks. Timeout sucks away your child's emotional security. Don't do time in. Don't do time out. Do time in. Time in. Think of that language. The language. Instead of time out, you do time in. Because children don't act out for attention. Children act out because they need attention. Right? So it's a whole different language pattern that represents a whole different consciousness. It's a whole different consciousness. And you can't really speak to someone who is stuck in an old conscious pattern and expect them to really understand this new consciousness, because it's foreign. It's foreign. So you have to, for those of us who are students, and I'm still a student of this stuff. That's why I think about this stuff. That's why I keep learning. That's why I'm advanced in this stuff. Because every conversation I have, I get to think about it. In fact, I was just talking to my friend Terry, who's there with her beautiful daughter. And she was texting me about a situation with two of her little girls. And it was around food. They're not eating at night. And let's just jump into this. This is perfect. It's perfect. They don't want to eat dinner like everyone else. Terry says they want comfort food, and they want junk food. And so then they end up going to bed hungry. And I know she's very sensitive to that. And so, the first thing I said is, okay, well, let's let everyone else eat, and you let them know that once everyone else is done, you'll sit with them, you'll eat with them, you'll feed them, whatever you need to do. She said, well, I've done that, and they don't want to do that. She said that they know that if they don't eat, they can't ask for ice cream, so they won't ask her for ice cream. They'll wait until ask dad for ice cream when he comes from work. And sometimes dad probably gives it to them and sometimes not. And so we were texting pretty late, and her last text was to the effect of, in the afternoon, they become ravenously hungry. They become ravenously hungry, and they want to eat up everything. They just want snacks, and they want to eat up everything. And so I said, change their dinner time to 3:00. And then I fell asleep. And then when I woke up this morning at 3:30, which is when I usually wake up for a little span of time, um, Terry had texted me, so 3 o'clock dinner. And I was like, and I didn't reply then because I didn't want to wake her up. So this morning I said, yes, 3 o'clock dinner for them. And the reason I tell you this story is because food issues are such a big issue, right? And so you got children, you got adopted children that come to you with all these disruptions of their circadian rhythms, and they don't eat very well. And so there are all these challenges usually around food. But bigger than that is the cultural, social, generational stories and conditioning that have been created around food. We have a near insanity when it comes to food in our society and in our culture and in the way we were raised. So yeah, some of us may have been deprived of food as children. You only know that story yourself. But what that means is any representation of food can trigger that anxiety for you, which takes you out of a present experience, which we're going to get into all this because today in session 3, we're going to talk about the brain. So you only know, and this goes back to session 1, you only know what your blueprints are. But when you become anxious and overwhelmed because of food, there are all these social, cultural, generational implications, which then as soon as we become scared, we move into our limbic brain, which tells us that we are going to die. That is what it does. It says, I am going to die. You are going to die. And so then your thinking goes offline and your short-term memory shuts down. And then the first thing we do is we feel hostage. We are held hostage. Bruce Perry calls it an amygdala hijacking. So when I said to Terry 3 o'clock for the two little girls, what I meant and what I heard is, number one, there's way too much fear and anxiety around whether or not they're going to eat. No one's going to starve. No one in our homes, in our culture, in our community, right here together, no one's going to starve. Your child's not going to starve. They will get food. They might get food at school. They might get food in the middle of the night when you're asleep. They might eat a little bit on their plate. They're not going to starve. No one's going to die. Okay, so we'll establish that. So they may, now this is by choice, and this is important. It is important because I also alluded to the fact that I've got another parent, and I haven't gotten an update on the situation yet, but she's been making her child go to bed without food. See, there's a difference between your children making the choice, having the power and the control, which is a positive, actually it's a positive perpetuating feedback loop, as opposed to a parent depriving the child of food and comfort. Food being equated, my connection is unstable. Food being equated to comfort. Let me pop out of this right quick as I finish this story. Okay, so I have to watch that because I don't want it to end up. Hey, Robert, why don't you cut your video off? I have to watch that because I don't want to. And Renee, you've still got yours on as well. So just letting you guys know you're on video, possibly. Food being correlated to comfort. Okay, food is correlated to comfort. When food is correlated to comfort, we have a lot of anxiety when it comes to food. And so we get worried and we get stressed, and we get worried and we become stressed around food. We stop listening, we stop thinking, we stop hearing. So when I said to Mom, feed them at 3 o'clock, what I was just saying is give into their natural rhythms. But see, we have so much anxiety in our old paradigm, in our old consciousness, our old way of living. We have so much anxiety around, well, you can't let a child decide when they're going to eat. It's ridiculous. But that's like a thought a parent has. Well, they have to sit down and eat dinner. They do, but they can sit down and eat dinner at 3 o'clock and you can sit down with them. Well, I can't sit down with them at 3 o'clock. Well, that's okay. Let them sit and have dinner themselves. The Point is, they're hungry at 3 o'clock. They're not hungry at 5 o'clock. And potentially, if we don't give them a lot of snacks at 3 o'clock, they could potentially still be hungry at 5 o'clock. So I say all that because the moment you become anxious and stressed, you move into the lower limbic system of your brain. You move into the part of your brain that tells you you are going to die. And it tells you that your child may die. That is a real message that your brain and body experiences. And when that happens, your thinking goes completely offline. Okay. So I'm sure that was relevant to you somewhere or another. I'm not sure. So all that to say, this training is specific to our adoptive parents and our adoptive families. Let's get right on in to session 3, stress and the brain. So I want to lay the framework for this. And here's one of the things that's always in my head. I always want to not talk too long, but I also want to slow down enough to give all the information I possibly can. And so I start squeezing in these sessions, like paring down the content so I can really focus. And then I end up talking way too much. The psychology of regulation. This is important because this is the foundation that we're going to be operating from. Our society, old consciousness. Old consciousness is steeped in cognitive behavioral psychology. It's Pavlovian psychology. And really, we call it Pavlovian or we call it cognitive behavioral, but it is a derivative from as far back as we can, from the days of Christ, when the masters would whip the slaves to build the castles and the cities and the pyramids. And, it's like this way of forcing someone to do what we want them to do because we are bigger and stronger and more powerful is steeped into the very being of who we are as a species. So in these days and times, it's called cognitive behavioral psychology. And it's so interesting to me that we call it cognitive behavioral psychology when it just means, threaten to beat someone and they'll do what you want them to do, or beat them and they'll do what you want them to do. Now, I make that statement in all honesty because cognitive behavioral psychology is basically an offshoot of spanking a child, yelling at a child, taking away, firing you at your job, taking away hours, just locking a child in their bedroom. All these things are geared towards changing thoughts, because the belief is that if you change thoughts, you will change feelings and you'll change behaviors. So it is a top-down psychology that thoughts, this is the dominant paradigm, the dominant consciousness. The dominant consciousness is, I may actually stop using the word paradigm and start using the word consciousness. The dominant consciousness, this is the dominant consciousness of our society, is that change the thought, change the way someone thinks. And so if I can yell at you and make you think badly enough about yourself, I can get you to change your behaviors. If I can threaten to hit you, or if I can threaten to take something away and scare you enough, I can get you to change your behaviors. If I hit you I can get you to change your behaviors because you'll be afraid of getting hit again. So then you'll change your thinking, so you'll change your behaviors. The problem with that is that it's backwards. It's old consciousness. New consciousness is the psychology of regulation. And the psychology of regulation, this is so important. The psychology of regulation says thoughts lead to feelings, which lead to behaviors. Thoughts lead to feelings, lead to behaviors. Same thing as cognitive behavioral psychology. However, the psychology of regulation says thoughts occur first on a body level, on an unconscious level, where all we do is react. That's important. That's so important. Thoughts occur first on a body level. Thoughts occur as a byproduct. Thoughts occur as a byproduct to our stress reaction system. We have trillions of cells in our body, trillions of cells, and all of the cells in your body have consciousness. All of the cells in your body are attached to emotion, and they're attached to memory. Thoughts occur first at an unconscious level. That's why we become stressed and anxious and overwhelmed, and we don't even know why. That's why you can become stressed and anxious and overwhelmed, and you talk to someone else, and they're like, hey, calm down. And then the more you talk to them, the more you calm down. Because they're not stressed out and anxious and overwhelmed at that body level. See, you're stressed out, anxious, and overwhelmed, and you don't even realize it. It's the thoughts at that body level that's driving all the emotions, that's driving all the thinking on a cognitive level. We have bad weather here, so I keep getting my little internet connection is unstable. So if I pause, it's for that reason. Now, I have my slides. Obviously, I had the slideshow on. So if I happen to get disconnected from you guys and I keep talking, or I'm talking and I'm frozen, please put in the chat you're frozen. And then what happens is it'll send me a little signal, because otherwise I don't see you guys. All I see is the slide. So this is really important. Thoughts occur first on an unconscious level of the body, at an emotional level. It is our emotions. Your body-mind system only knows two emotional states, two energetic states. It knows a thriving state and it knows a surviving state. That's all you know at an emotional level. And that emotional experience, whatever it is, whatever that emotional experience is, it gives way, it dictates to your thinking at a cognitive level, but it starts down here and it dictates up here, and this is what comes out. So what happens is what comes out isn't really reflective of the true story and experience that's occurring internally. And then also, because so many of these things that your children have experienced and so many of these things that you have experienced starting from conception all the way up to age 5 are oftentimes pre-verbal. So you don't even have a formalized concrete memory of the experience. And because you don't have a formalized concrete memory of the experience, when it gets triggered at an unconscious level and it comes up to your cognitive process and then comes out through your behavior, you don't say, oh my God, I'm so stressed out right now because the thought of you not eating your food just made me remember when I didn't have any food as a baby. You don't do that, right? You don't have that eureka moment. What happens is the thought of the other person, of the child not eating the food, triggers the unconscious thought and emotional survival memory state of the adult then that emotion gets stirred up and it changes their consciousness, and then out comes their thinking and their thoughts. And they're not congruent to what the real experience is. And then when they're not congruent to what the real experience is, then oftentimes we end up missing the boat completely. So the psychology of regulation is about looking at the processes, the emotional, energetic, unconscious processes, the reactive processes. The single best thing you could do in any situation is to slow down and to breathe, to stop, to slow down and to breathe. Now think about this for a moment, because my ultimate goal is to empower you as a parent and to empower you as a provider who goes in to support the parents. When there is a moment of stress occurring or unraveling or unfolding, what if instead of trying to talk it out or figure it out or make the child do something different or get the parent to do something different in that moment, what if all you did was slow down and took some deep breaths and listened? What if you did that? What if you focused on that? See, your old consciousness tells you that that is not enough. My new consciousness tells me that that is the beginning of everything. It is the beginning of everything. And this doesn't mean that we don't have disagreements. This doesn't mean that we just accept what someone else is doing. It doesn't mean that at all. What it means is we show up in that relationship in a more centered, more grounded, more present, more emotionally present way. We show up with much more energy when we show up present. That's what it means. So the psychology of regulation is about understanding that thoughts and feelings occur first on an unconscious level. They occur first on an unconscious level. And those thoughts and feelings that occur on an unconscious level generate an energy that dictates our thinking on a cognitive level, on our conscious cognitive level. But typically, there's a separation between the two. So, last session, I talked about the stress model. And the reason I'm coming back here to summarize this again is because the stress model is a representation of the psychology of regulation, which says thoughts, therefore behaviors, are a byproduct of stress first. That's the unconscious reactive experience. See, thoughts and ultimately behaviors are a byproduct of stress. Let's see, the thing is we tend to want to get in and just fix it. We want to get in and fix something instead of spending time understanding it. This is important. I keep saying that. This is important. Sometimes this stuff feels like life or death to me. So often we approach behavioral challenges and conflicts from a standpoint of wanting to fix them as opposed to understand them. We want to make them better. We want to make them go away. We want them to change. We want them to lower in their intensity, as opposed to just understanding from where they're coming from. That's a big statement. All behavior, therefore thought, occurs at the level of the body at an unconscious place from a level of stress. In between the behavior and the stress is the presence of a primary emotion. Hang on a minute, I just got a little signal. Oh, good. All behavior arises and thoughts arise from a state of stress. In between the behavior and the stress is the presence of a primary emotion. There are only two primary emotions. love, and fear. Love and fear. You're only two. Remember, emotion is energy and motion. It's energy and motion. There are only two emotional states, two energies, a thriving state and a surviving state. It's through the expression, the processing, and the understanding of the fear that we calm the stress and diminish the behavior. Fear says, fix it. Too many times, the things we encounter that show up as threats to us, and I'm going to get into that in just a moment, we want to fix them instead of understanding them. And before you can understand them, you have to understand yourself. Because a lot of times, understanding yourself, calming yourself, actually helps you gain maybe not even a full understanding of why another person is behaving the way they are. What it does is help you gain an understanding of why you're feeling and reacting the way you're feeling. And then by gaining a deeper understanding of why you're reacting and feeling the way you're feeling, you actually have less energetic responsibility for what another person's going through. Because what another person's going through is their process. It's not your process. So oftentimes, just by calming yourself, you're able to piece through what may be happening for another person because you have less investment in it. Now that may sound somewhat, cold or callous, that you have less investment in what someone else is feeling, experiencing. It really isn't. You just have to invest in yourself. You have to invest in yourself first so that you can hear them and honor them and support them and not feel overwhelmed by them. You actually need to have less investment. But let's talk about what that looks like when we start talking about the brain. Now, this is a very important, there I am saying it again, talking about how important this is. This is a very important discussion. The brain. I'm starting this here because I want you to see at a structural level the difference between a normally developed brain versus a brain that has been exposed to extreme neglect. There are physical structural differences. See, we forget these things. We don't see these things. But see, as a part of this new consciousness, I want you to be able to talk about the brain. I want you to be able to understand the brain. I want you to be able to think about what your child's brain is doing in that moment. So you need to realize how serious this is, because ultimately, this is all about changing the body-mind system. This is all about changing the brain. So these are critical areas of the brain for behavior, stress, and healing. Okay, so the first part we're going to look at is the amygdala. Okay, and I practiced with my little pen here, so hopefully I can be a little bit more clear in my drawings. Your amygdala is responsible for your fight. It's responsible for your flight. And it is responsible for your freeze. Your amygdala completes its development in the first 18 months. The first 18 months. The amygdala completes its development in the first 18 months. It is a part of your brain referred to as the limbic system, which is this structure here. Includes your pituitary. Now, what you have to understand about this is that your amygdala, the thing it does is it releases cortisol. And it starts from in utero. Cortisol is your brain's primary stress hormone. You have to have it in order to grow, to thrive, to digest, to process. It's an essential. It's called your primary stress hormone. There's a secondary stress hormone that occurs in the gut, and that's called adrenaline. But your adrenal glands develop secondarily to your amygdala. So your amygdala's primary responsibility, and this goes back to our session 2, is to sense threats in the environment. To sense threats in the environment. When the amygdala senses a threat in the environment, it releases cortisol. That's stress. Okay? Cortisol and stress, same thing. When your amygdala senses a threat in the environment, it releases cortisol. When your amygdala senses a threat in the environment, it knocks your body-mind system out of balance and starts to release cortisol. The cortisol is like the actual bullet that comes from the gun. The amygdala is the trigger, right? It's the hammer. So bam, it's bam, it hits the bullet, and the bullet projects out of the gun and it goes through the brain. All right. So your amygdala is like a light switch. You've heard of fight, you've heard of flight, you've heard of freeze. And we all have a dominant reaction pattern, but our first initial reaction is always to freeze. We freeze first. And that's why Bruce Perry said, anytime we encounter a novel event, we perceive that event as a threat until deemed otherwise. Anytime you encounter a novel event, you perceive that event as a threat until deemed otherwise. So anytime you encounter anything new, it's a threat until deemed otherwise. And after repetition, it's no longer as threatening, right? But new experiences of any sort become threats, which then just overwhelm the body. So you freeze first. You freeze, and then you determine whether you're going to fight or whether you're going to flee. Now, flight, just like children who run away, is on the continuum of hypo. I don't think this is going to work. I think my finger's going to work. Is on the continuum. Forget that one. Flight is on the continuum of hypoarousal. Hypoarousal, shutting down, withdrawing, running away. Fight is on the continuum of hyperarousal, right? This is being hyperactive. This is being aggressive. This is being violent. This is throwing things and breaking things. Hypo is your oppositional defiance. Hyper is your ADHD. Hypo is your depression. Hyper is your conduct disorder. Could be your post-traumatic stress disorder. Could be your reactive attachment disorder. Hypo, your brain shuts down. Hyper, your brain activates. So when your amygdala gets triggered, and we all do this. This is applicable to all of us. When your amygdala gets triggered and it releases from a state of freeze, it goes into fight or flight. Now, that cortisol is that bullet, and that bullet passes through the pituitary to the hippocampus. Now, next to the pituitary is a structure called your hypothalamus. What's supposed to happen when your amygdala releases cortisol, it's supposed to pass the pituitary, and it's supposed to trigger your hypothalamus. And now what's important about your hypothalamus is that it releases oxytocin. Oxytocin is your brain's anti-stress hormone. Within the hypothalamus is also your suprachiasmatic nucleus. Within your next to the pituitary in the hypothalamus is another structure of nerves called the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's a little nerve bundle. This little bundle of nerves is responsible for your circadian rhythms. This little bundle of nerves is responsible for your brain and body's connection to tell you when you're hungry, to tell you when you're full, to tell you when you're tired, to tell you when you need to wake up, to tell you when you need to go to sleep, to tell you when it's starting to get dark. It's all these, your circadian rhythms, your food, your digestion, your sleep, all these things are controlled by your circadian rhythms. When your amygdala shoots off that bullet of cortisol to your pituitary, passes your pituitary to your hippocampus, your hypothalamus is supposed to release oxytocin, and it's supposed to go in a counter direction, right? It goes in a counter direction because oxytocin is your brain's anti-stress hormone. Now look how I just did that. You see I have the red, which represents the cortisol. It's inside, but then the oxytocin is outside. Your oxytocin is your brain's anti-stress hormone. Now, Susan Kachinskas in Chemistry of Connection says oxytocin is the hormone that makes love possible. So if oxytocin is the hormone that makes love possible, then cortisol is the hormone that makes fear possible. So we have this battle between oxytocin and cortisol. So here's the thing. I'm going to say it again. This is important. Your oxytocin response is a learned response. Your oxytocin response. So your brain's ability to release oxytocin is a learned experience. And your hypothalamus, therefore, your oxytocin response is not fully developed until the 36th month. See, I can't do this pin because it's just too much. The 36th month. 3 years. Remember, I said your amygdala completes its development by the 18th month. Your hypothalamus and your hippocampus is actually open throughout the lifespan, along for development throughout the lifespan, along with the hypothalamus. Doesn't come fully online until the 36th month, a full 18 months after your amygdala. This is why you have the terrible twos. We in our society, in our old consciousness, we've labeled behaviors, we've labeled stress-based behaviors in a negative way. We call them the terrible twos, but really it's only speaking to a child who is in a brain stage, a developmental brain stage, where their oxytocin is not yet balancing their cortisol. So they're more prone to cortisol, which means they're more prone to stranger danger. They're more prone to hyperactivity. They're more prone to getting into things. They're more prone to moving. And we call that the terrible twos, but really it's not. It's just an experience. It's a byproduct of an experience of their hypothalamus not being fully developed. So during that period of time, the parent has to be the effective regulatory figure. Now, this is important. Your oxytocin response is a learned response. So if you are a child who comes from an experience, comes from a background, and we're in our next session, we're going to talk about trauma. We're not going to talk about trauma today, but it's hard to talk about the brain and not talk about trauma. But if you are a child who comes from a background of stress, which means your amygdala is being constantly activated, so you're constantly firing off these bullets of cortisol. You're constantly firing off. And what you have to understand is that your limbic system is connected to your gut via neural pathways. There are neural pathways which run from your amygdala down to your gut. That's why I referenced Candace Pert in session 1 or 2, that a gut feeling is not a metaphor, it is a biological reality, because the signals of your gut and the signals of your amygdala are on this interchangeable highway. So then what happens is that if you are a child being raised in an environment of early neglect, then you're having an experience of overwhelming cortisol. What you're not having is an interruption, is a sufficient interruption. If you're having an overwhelming experience of cortisol, what you're not having is an interruption of oxytocin. And if you're not having an interruption of oxytocin, then what's happening is the cortisol is overwhelming your brain. And when the cortisol begins to overwhelm the brain, then what it does is it starts to damage the other structures in your brain. So then what happens is your hypothalamus, which is a learned response, isn't learning to respond to stress at all. It's just shut down. It's insufficient. And then what happens is your hippocampus, which is supposed to, the part of your brain also that comes fully online at the 36th month, which is responsible for your short-term memory, isn't developing at all. In fact, the dendrites in the hippocampus are shrinking and shriveling. So your hippocampus, responsible for your short-term memory, which is then responsible for giving signals, clear signals to your prefrontal cortex. So if your hippocampus is responsible for giving clear signals to your prefrontal cortex, your orbital frontal cortex, this is the executive control center for all your social and emotional functioning. Your orbital frontal cortex is your executive control center for all your social and emotional functioning. But if cortisol, and this is an early experience, if the cortisol in your brain is not being adequately interrupted by oxytocin, which means you don't have adults who are coming and adequately soothing you, therefore turning on your oxytocin, then what's happening is that these very important regulatory structures in your brain, like the hypothalamus and the hippocampus, are being disrupted. Not only are they being disrupted, research has shown that dendrites in the hippocampus can actually shrink and shrivel. So now they're smaller, and now your oxytocin response isn't working effectively. And guess what? The suprachiasmatic nucleus is knocked offline. So now you're a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old who isn't effectively potty trained. It's not that you're not effectively potty trained. It's that your brain does not signal in stress. Your brain does not signal to your gut that you need to go to the bathroom. It doesn't give you enough warning. You get stressed and it goes from brain to gut to poop or pee, because that's your suprachiasmatic nucleus is knocked offline, right? So then you're a child who can't sleep. Like you're a 3-year-old who can't sleep, or you're a 3-year-old who sleeps all the time because you can't wake up, because you're stressed out all the time, and your oxytocin response is not calming the cortisol enough to then train your suprachiasmatic nucleus how to wake you up when the sun comes up. So then it's hard for you to get out of bed. Or even the other side of that, the sun comes up, your suprachiasmatic nucleus turns on, and it spikes to 100. So now you're hyper first thing in the morning, and you're irritable, and you're agitated, and you're running around, and you're being crazy, and you're driving your parents nuts. You don't eat when you're supposed to because your suprachiasmatic nucleus is not working the way it's dysregulated. It's not working the way it's supposed to. And then guess what happens? And this is all because of having an absent oxytocin response. Then what happens is the messages from your hippocampus get sent to your orbital frontal cortex. And this is your brain's social and emotional control center. So guess where you struggle? In social and emotional relationships. Now, these people who grow up as adults don't have a lot of friends. They don't have a lot of friends because it's hard to navigate the social and emotional relationships. These people, such as myself, who grow up and become adults, tend to be workaholics because work becomes a way for creating soothing. In a maladaptive way, you work yourself into exhaustion because you're not turning on your oxytocin response enough to regulate your brain and your body system enough because you didn't get the early regulatory experience, the early supportive regulatory experience to teach your oxytocin response to turn on in the face of stress. And when you don't have that early oxytocin experience, you can't calm the brain. But when you do have that early oxytocin experience, what happens is that you start to release oxytocin in the presence of cortisol. And guess what? You begin to calm down. Now, here's what's important. And so then when you begin to calm down, guess what? The signals change. So then you have more effective social and emotional relationships because the signals change. But here's what you have to understand. These parts of your brain, these two structures, along with this structure, they are open for development throughout the lifespan. Well, not the hippocampus. The hippocampus is actually one of the parts of the brain that over time, due to stress, gets smaller. This is why we from 25 years, from 25, so your orbital frontal cortex doesn't actually complete its development until you're 25. But peak learning states start to decline after the age of 25. After the age of 25, peak learning is on a rapid decline. But our ability to learn how to regulate and to calm ourselves and to turn our oxytocin on is open throughout the lifespan, along with the orbital frontal cortex. So our ability to navigate, and I think that there's a connection between the two. There's a connection between the functioning of the hypothalamus and the optimal functioning of the orbital frontal cortex, because that part of your brain, as you can teach your hypothalamus how to release oxytocin, it is a self-regulating system. So as you can learn to breathe in the presence of stress, as you make it an important component of your day-to-day life and what you do, you are teaching your brain to do something different. And that becomes important. That becomes important. And it's also important to understand that because your suprachiasmatic nucleus is located next to your hypothalamus, then you can get that structure back online. And this is why parents started to have success getting their children potty trained again, when they understand that it's not about the potty training you're creating. It's what you're creating is the connection between the brain and the body. And when you help the child to regulate and you help to slow down the cortisol, then what you begin doing is you start to retrain the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And so then the child starts to be able to create their own self-regulating, self-supportive and regulating system themselves. So the key terms, again, the prefrontal cortex is open for change and development throughout the lifespan. For girls, it matures at the age of 23, between 22 and 23. For boys, it doesn't mature until 25. But this is why, in most instances, parent-child relationships improve after the child turns 25. And I believe it's because the child is actually more capable of navigating the parent's challenges than it is any byproduct of the parent changing, because old consciousness doesn't change. Old consciousness thinks that everything and everyone else needs to change, because old consciousness wants to stay right where it is, because old consciousness is based in fear. And when old consciousness is rooted in fear, it's rooted in survival. So it becomes rigid and it doesn't like to change, right? New consciousness is open for change and development. New consciousness, which is love-based, understands the importance of flow, the flow of energy. And you can't constrict energy. If you constrict energy, you die. You have to keep energy flowing. So it's very important. So then we have your amygdala, cortisol, adrenaline, your brainstem, your hypothalamus and oxytocin, your suprachiasmatic nucleus, and your hippocampus. Now, I talk about almost all of these in From Fear to Love, and all of you should have a copy of my book, From Fear to Love. If you don't have a copy of From Fear to Love, let me know so I can get you a copy. But everyone should have a copy. It should be one of the first things you get when you start Wraparound and when you enter in our training program, because it's just a flagship book. Everyone needs to read it. Everyone needs to read it 5 times. From Fear to Love. So if you don't have a copy, be sure to let me know so we can get you a copy. Remember, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. This is very important. There is no fear in love. Love and fear do not coexist. They cannot coexist. They're in different structures of your brain. They're in different structures of your brain. What we have to learn to do is we have to learn to calm our fear, calm our stress, because our stress generates our fear. When we can learn to calm our stress and lower our fear and our anxiety, we can make room for the presence and the space of love. When we can do that, we can step more into our power. So this will be part 1. Next session will be part 2 of the brain, because this is actually supposed to be the brain and stress and then trauma. So this is all a segment of experiences that we have to go through, that we will be going through as we start to learn the new language of consciousness, which is going to be exclusive to our culture, exclusive to our community, exclusive to our people. We're going to speak this new language because it's going to represent our new consciousness. And then we're going to enlighten everybody else across the world, because that's what we do. All right. God bless you all. And I will see you next week. Hey, and watch these sessions
Love you, Bryan.
again.
Thank you.